the only industry, and Evelyn said this so well, it's the only industry where the manufacturer blames the consumer and the consumer doesn't blame the manufacturer when it doesn't work. When your product doesn't work, you get the blame for it, right? You failed the diet didn't fail you.
It's because you weren't strict enough within the rules that we gave you.
Right. So what would someone do if they didn't feel like they were strict enough and didn't work?
Yeah, welcome back to our next chat. Today we're going to be talking with Davin again about some of the different guidelines for intuitive eating. So we're going to kind of dive into some of the definitions of intuitive eating and talk about some points of interest that I definitely had when I was first starting to learn about it. So yeah, let's go ahead and Davin, I'll let you kind of take it off and we'll kind of maneuver from there.
Yeah, so intuitive eating, I'm really excited to talk about this. It's gaining a lot of traction within social media, within the general public about kind of this emerging nutrition idea in this year. They actually released their intuitive eating book this past week. It's their 4th edition, so it encompasses all the research up to this point and their knowledge. So it's a really new, not so new, developed in 1995, but an awesome way to look at nutrition and taking care of your body that is somewhat misunderstood. So I'm hoping within this conversation we can kind of say what it is and then say what it isn't, and then kind of pick out the great things that are up to individuals' interpretation.
Great. Cool. So as far as intuitive eating goes, let's just dive right into some definitions. Can you maybe discuss a little bit about really what intuitive eating is as a methodology or as that framework?
Yeah, so intuitive eating is it's something we're all born with. From the second we're born, we know what we need from a food perspective. We know what we need from a relationship perspective. But as we get older, there are different rules, there are different constraints that kind of impose on us that disconnect us from our internal cues and signals that tell us what we should eat, how much should we eat, what sounds good, and all those different things. So kind of the way they put it, the developers of intuitive eating, is it's an inside job, right? So all of the cues that we need about food come from the inside rather than external. So what we call that is interoceptive awareness, and that's a term you're going to hear a lot from me, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But just creating a framework of 10 principles to help you connect with that interoceptive awareness.
All right. So yeah, you kind of explained the general idea of intuitive eating, why it's aptly named as intuitive eating. So that it kind of takes us back to our intuition that we were born with. We discussed a little bit of interoceptive awareness. So we have here that we want to talk a little bit about interoceptive sensitivity. So can you talk about what that means specifically?
Yeah, so interoceptive awareness, just the sensations in our body that we feel that help us, give us feedback, right? So our body speaks to our mind, and our mind tells us what we need to do to appropriately address those sensations. So a very obvious form of interoceptive awareness is your bladder, right? So if you have a full bladder, it signals to your mind, hey, we have to go use the bathroom. Perfect. That's a great signal. And our hunger has that same ability too. It's just, like I mentioned, over the course of time, our sensitivity to that awareness either heightens or decreases or stays the same. So an example they use in a lot of research studies looking at interoceptive awareness, particularly in mindfulness, they asked participants to perceive their own heart rate without touching their pulse in any way, shape, or form, by just sitting there and trying to sense their pulse and their heart rate. So if you're listening to this, you can pause it and go ahead and try that. And they found that people with higher interoceptive sensitivity were more likely intuitive eaters. So just that sensations we feel in our body, the more in tune with we are with those, they allow us to connect to our actual needs.
That's really interesting. I like that you brought up people that are more interoceptively aware. I would like to think that I'm personally interoceptively aware, just from having done martial arts pretty much my whole life. I'm aware my heartbeat at all times. I'm aware of, where, like, proprioceptively, at least I know where my body is in space. And I think a lot of athletes also have that issue, but at the same time, a lot of athletes also have some disordered eating. So, uh, um, how do you think, what are maybe some confounding factors that kind of create that lack, or that decreased sensitivity to our those cues?
Yeah. So not to jump ahead, but all the principles within intuitive eating, they either help bolster our awareness or they help remove the barriers to our awareness. So
Okay.
as we go through those, you'll start to see how those different principles connect with us in helping us heighten those senses or removing those barriers that get in the way of us actually hearing those. We kind of think of it as someone knocking at the door, right? If you can't hear them knocking at the door, you don't know there's someone there.
Right.
So the louder that knock becomes, you'll be like, hey, someone's there. Let's go. We need to go address it.
Okay. So is that kind of what we're leading to with interoceptive responsiveness? So kind of that extra piece to sensitivity.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's essentially what it sounds like. It's us responding to that awareness that we have. So we know someone's at the door, but we don't answer it, right? Or we know we're hungry. Our body's telling us we're hungry, but we're still not answering it and meeting that need. So we can be aware of all these things happening, but it's our ability to respond to those appropriately in typically and hopefully kind and compassionate ways that help us work through those different sensations that we have. So all of those three is what intuitive eating is about. It's kind of the foundation upon what it is, and it's very similar, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, to mindfulness and intuitive eating and how they're different but the same.
Okay, great. So can you talk a little bit about what intuitive eating as a framework can really offer the general public, athletes, just anyone who seeks to dive into kind of returning back to that intuition?
Yeah, I think a big piece of it is being at peace with food. A lot of times we can have a little voice in our head that makes us feel anxious, makes us feel stressed, makes us feel guilty around eating certain foods, or seeing other people eating certain foods, and kind of just being at peace with those emotions so we can focus on a lot of other things. Um, an example from our last conversation is just, connecting with people. If I'm at the table and I'm thinking about counting the macronutrients in the food, I'm not really engaged with the conversation or the event happening. Analogous to that, we talk about, like, if you're on a phone call with someone and you're like, or you're like on Instagram, but you're not talking to them on speaker, and you're like, yeah, yeah, and you're just answering their questions, but you're not really connected, right? So taking that analogy and saying that's how some people's behaviors around food is, and in the culture and climate we live in of dieting and thin ideal standards of beauty that aren't achievable by many people for various reasons. It's a way that we can all pursue our own individual nutrition preferences, and it's all our own journey. So that's what I really like about it. It's not something that concerning someone else but yourself, and it's a lifelong way of eating. So specifically with athletes, I like to teach them intuitive eating because after their athletic career, they're going to need information, right, on how to eat and how to fuel themselves. Or say someone has a medical condition, right, diabetes, or someone gets some other chronic disease. Intuitive eating works, the framework works in all these conditions, and it doesn't change at all at any point in time. So something really beneficial out of it.
Yeah, definitely. So we've noted that it definitely serves as a guideline, and it's not one thing to make a huge point of is that it's their guidelines, it's a framework, but it's not a distinct set of rules. And I think that when we get into the actual the tenets of intuitive eating, it will make more sense, because when I first got into it, it seems like, okay, well, I'm going to be ditching one diet style rules for another diet style rules, even though it's not really labeled as a diet. So I'm excited to get into that distinction between framework versus rules.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of on that same note, with the categorization, I think that people naturally like to understand the things that are around them. We seek to categorize. All of science is basically looking deeper, and in order to look deeper, we have to categorize things and and put things into perspective with respect to other parts. So in terms of dieting, we've for the past, when did the first diet come around? Maybe when would you say?
The potentially the shaming around bodies and things of that nature that leads to dieting typically was early as the 1500s.
Okay.
But modern dieting, as we know it, was more in the 20s when women started to be pressured into looking a certain way. And then slowly men started to fall under that same pressure continually throughout the 60s and 70s. So you see it start to take off once the 1900s occurred typically.
Okay. Yeah. So when, maybe in the 1920s, when all of this started, we looked at trying to categorize different foods as ways to do this or that to your body. And it's well understood now that you can't burn certain types of fat off of certain areas. But foods were marketed in those types of ways. We tried to categorize. So what are some possible advantages or maybe and disadvantages to labeling food in this way, and to say that this can do this specific thing for you?
Yeah, just to that point earlier, it wasn't just food at one point. So when cigarettes were a big thing, cigarettes were marketed as a way to a means to weight loss.
Yeah.
Seeing that as a potential avenue for people to use, and that kind of reinforces this. It's an advantage for manufacturers, but for consumers, it's a disadvantage in that our ability to consume products is in their benefit and to our default demise in a sense. When we start to consume more in the sense that our bodies will never be perfect, right? That's a narrative that gets told to us from a very young age now in these days,
Yeah.
Reinforced through social media, reinforced through our policies in health and our healthcare systems. This reinforcing of thinner bodies or dieting, it really disserves us as a group. So when we start to label foods in a certain way, we start to create more division than inclusiveness. And that's one major part that I don't really like when we start to look at labeling things in a binary sense.
Okay. So how would you kind of on that labeling piece, when there are foods that people will look at and say, okay, maybe like fast food compared to some like whole foods that you can get along the outside of the grocery store. When we try to categorize those things, there's a lot of there would probably be a lot of pushback to saying like, well, obviously there's these certain types of foods that are going to be bad for us. How would you address that in the context of intuitive?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to refute that. I've studied nutritional science, and there are some foods that have potential benefits to our health from a nutritional value standpoint.
Right.
But in its place within the intuitive eating principles, it's the last one. It's the 10th principle. Because if we interject putting the nutritional content and the value of food in front of all the other aspects of it, it really inhibits us from connecting with our interoceptive awareness, right? So we kind of put it at the back end to say, now that you're aware of what your body needs, let's do some gentle nutrition. That's what it's called. The 10th principle is gentle nutrition.
Okay.
So I'll never say certain foods don't have different nutritional value. Some have more nutrition, some have potentially less. And there is science to prove that. I'm not refuting that. But definitely when we start to lump it in all together with like morals and ethics about food, we start to disconnect ourselves, and that's problematic.
Great. Awesome. Yeah. So we'll definitely get into that when we finally hit that last point. So we'll get deeper in there. So there's one thing that I'd like to comment on in terms of the way that we categorize things. I'd like to talk about how we've categorized obesity. So you made some notes that I'd love for you to discuss here. So we have policies that push a specific body type or push at least negativity against a specific body type for good or for better or for worse. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah. So if we look at the historical context of a lot of these policies, we see that they can be rooted in a lot of narrow thinking, in a sense. BMI was created by an astronomer, a statistician who really wanted to look at um, general body sizes within a white population. So when we take that metric and we start to apply it to larger groups of diverse people, we know that's not the accurate measure of a lot of things, of health particularly. But when we start to create obesity and we label it as an epidemic in our country, or um, you know, a serious risk for mortality, we start to pathologize larger bodies, which we know is not true, and it's harmful for a variety of reasons. In President Bush campaign, he quoted the term "war on obesity." Michelle Obama had an initiative to stop childhood obesity. So kind of almost putting blame in certain areas, specifically with childhood obesity, when we start to label kids as obese, that fault comes at the parents, right? And that guilt associated with that can really drive individuals to diet even more. So these health policies further reinforce this diet mentality that thinness is health. There are good and bad foods. Um, Health is a smaller body rather than a larger body, which does discriminate against a large portion of individuals.
Right.
And the science and research is refuting a lot of these theories and ideas around the idea of obesity.
Great. Yeah, and I would love to dive more into some of that literature as we go through. After maybe once we get done with some of the principles, and we can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
So speaking of research, though, let's definitely get into the so Evelyn Tribole, the one of the founders of the intuitive eating framework. I've heard her discuss a lot about the literature, that some of the longitudinal studies that she's both kept up with and also assisted with, in terms of tracking somebody who's doing intuitive eating over time, and as well as the way that we categorize diets, and what, like, the end result of a diet in the long term. So these longitudinal studies looked at dieting and then how these people ended up 10 years later. So I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit about that in terms of what that effect is.
Yeah. Some statistics: 95% of people who diet regain the weight within 5 years. 2/3 of those individuals end up gaining more weight than they had started at prior to dieting. Dieting is the most prominent risk factor for weight gain. So if you're trying to gain weight, the first thing you should do is probably go on a diet. Seems very counterintuitive to what we're told, but that's what the science is indicating. A lot of the research done in journals surrounding the topic of obesity, if you look at the study duration, they don't extend follow-ups to patients or to study participants longer than a certain period of time. And if they were to follow those individuals, you would see either weight regain, or you would see more disordered eating behaviors to maintain that weight loss, which is often another missed piece in this, is that sure, someone might be able to lose weight, but how are they keeping the weight off? Because we know the body can re-signal ourselves to regain that weight. It's called weight rebound, very simple. And sometimes it does this phenomenon called fat overshooting. So our body protects itself from famine, essentially, right? Protects itself and gains more weight. So just in case you do it again, it has a little buffer, a little cushion to protect itself if you do diet again. And that's a great mechanism to have. Genetically, right? Our ancestors' starvation was a very real thing. And to lose that genetic trait would be detrimental to our species. So it serves a very large purpose, and I think very valuable, and it shouldn't be frowned upon. It's actually a good thing. It means your body's functioning properly.
Yeah, so I think, drawing back to the evolutionary aspect of the way that our bodies evolved to maintain our survival, that's really important. I think that really that was something that always drew me to specific types of food habits. Because I mean, especially like, and we've since proven that paleo isn't necessarily an actual Paleolithic diet, but a lot of people jumped on it because like intuitively it's like, okay, well maybe they were scavenging a lot, so they're eating a lot of nuts, a lot of fruit, a lot of meats. They're probably in certain areas they didn't have certain types of foods. But then we sort of extrapolate that and we create these extremes of these dieting styles.
Mm-hmm.
So it can definitely be good to keep those in context, but also not to abuse it.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. You noted this, and I didn't see that you noted it until just now. But I was interested in hearing about this. The Biggest Loser study, the Biggest Loser show. Even when I was deep into my personal dieting and I was bodybuilding, and I saw The Biggest Loser, I thought to myself, like, there's no way that this is healthy for. There's no way that this is healthy for their mental health. And then they started to follow up. Some extra studies would start to follow up, and these people were regaining weight. Can you talk a little bit more about the Biggest Loser study? If people
Yeah, super popular show, and I think it really shaped a lot of people's perceptions on individuals and larger bodies. It shapes people's perception around exercise. Exercise should be used for weight loss, especially if you look a certain body type. And people like you more if you lose weight, right? That's kind of the underlying message there. What they did was they took contestants from The Biggest Loser and followed up with them after they left the show and lost all the weight. What they found was that a lot of those individuals regained that weight back, and some even more, in just as fast of a time. Another thing that they measured was their metabolic rate, right? Something that they had lost, even though they had regained weight, was their lean muscle mass. We know lean muscle mass is the largest contributor to your metabolism in consumption of energy. And that decrement, just to throw out an average of a number, is 700 calories less in their metabolism that they didn't regain for their basal metabolic rate. So you can look at that, and now their body reduced its energy output to save and conserve energy. So damaging that metabolism is a huge consequence when you start to look at this concept of weight cycling, right? Instead of weight stability. So someone who varies up and down in their weight is higher risk for diabetes, higher risk for cardiovascular disease, a myriad of other diseases. So rather than trying to fluctuate weight too much, we would rather stabilize it in this case. And that's what that study showed.
Wow. So that's actually a great caveat into the next piece. So let's talk about stabilizing our weight, stabilizing our eating habits and such. One thing that got very popular, especially with a lot of dietitians in the past few decades, was intuitive eating. Intuitive eating, mindful eating, which has, like you said earlier, draws a lot of similarities. So let's talk a little bit about some mindful eating.
Yeah. So Evelyn and Elise, when they had originally thought of writing intuitive eating, they had been counseling in the dieting fashion prior to, and they realized their client success wasn't going very well. So a real big part of it was the interoceptive awareness, and where they drew that concept from was mindfulness. So Buddhism is a contributor to that, and mindfulness and meditation. They do a lot of that themselves. So thinking about that concept in mindfulness, there's a lot of researchers who research mindfulness, interoceptive awareness, and there's a lot of overlap with intuitive eating. The best way that I could verbalize it, and it's been verbalized by others, so I use their interpretation, is mindfulness is a skill set for eating,
right?
And intuitive eating is a framework for self-care. So very abstract in a sense, but the more you kind of hear about the differences, particularly one difference, and that's the main difference, you'll kind of see how they're significantly different. Mindful eating, it's that interoceptive awareness of all the sensations around eating, right? Particularly, so when you're full, when you're hungry, what the food tastes like, all those different things, kind of being 100% aware and invested in the act of eating. And that's fundamental. It's a fundamental thing.
Yeah. Okay. So how are intuitive eating and mindful eating related then? Where can we draw some similarities?
Yeah, so all the principles 2 through 10 you see in mindfulness, they call it different things. I'm not quite sure what the one-to-one term is, but honoring your hunger, making peace with food, rejecting the food police, taking care of your body, all those different things are encompassed in mindful eating. The biggest difference is the first principle is rejecting the diet mentality. So someone can mindfully eat while simultaneously dieting, but one cannot eat intuitively and diet at the same time. So the biggest difference is that.
Okay. Um, so yeah, we discussed how the differences. So what are maybe some advantages? So I mean, if mindful eating is really just this huge portion of intuitive eating, then what are some advantages to maybe starting off with mindful eating, or should we maybe dive straight into intuitive eating?
Yeah, I think it's everyone's individual journey. Um, People's diet history typically indicates to me whether or not they'd be ready for taking that big step in rejecting the diet mentality, because typically the clients I get are people who have dieted and dieted for long periods of time with little to no success. Um, and, and I mean, I'm not surprised by that, but based off the literature. But those are the individuals I'm getting in. And if we can cultivate skills first of mindfulness, they can always jump to different ones that feel appropriate to them at the time.
So it might be a good starting place. And because it's such a huge portion of intuitive eating, I think yeah, it might be a really great starting place. For me, that was the part that vibed with me the most about intuitive eating when I first dove into it, because I am Buddhist, so a lot of the principles really resonate with the general idea of my spirituality. So it's paying attention, the focus, and taking a step back, looking at the bigger picture, and applying that to food. It's sometimes it's tough to take a step back and see, like, oh wow, this is the food that I'm eating. I'm not just shoveling it in my face. Uh, so, you talked a little bit about the difference between you can mindfully eat and still diet. Um, you have a note in here about Cara Harbstreet. Can you
Mm-hmm.
talk about that?
Yeah, so she's a intuitive eating dietitian out of Kansas City, Missouri, who I follow on Instagram, and y'all should follow her if you do have Instagram. Um, but she had a post, and I thought it resonated really well with the difference between intuitive eating and mindfulness eating, in that she had posted possibilities with intuitive eating. And the first bullet point is caring for your body if it gets bigger. Second one is caring for your body if it stays the same size, and caring for your body if it gets a little smaller. If you're aiming for that last point, which is to make your body smaller, you now turn intuitive eating as a framework into an actual diet. Diet being intentionally eating to lose weight or make your body smaller. Um, and intuitive eating as a framework for self-care versus a set of skills. It means you care for your body regardless of its size. So we call that body acceptance, accepting your body how it is in the moment, and then also rejecting the rules around eating. Because you can mindfully eat, but still have lots of rules around eating and what to eat and how much and things like that.
Right. Okay, I think that's a great transition also into that very first tip, the very first principle of intuitive eating, which is rejecting the diet mentality. So, um, when it comes to rejecting the diet mentality, what exactly are we really trying to reject there? Like, what is the diet mentality?
Yeah, the diet mentality is an individual's perception of what diets can do, the lifestyle diets hold, consuming diet thoughts, beliefs, behaviors. Um, there's this false hope around trying a new diet, right? I remember when I was dieting when I was younger. Um, there was always this excitement I got, like I'd lose weight quickly, I get lean, and it'd be a permanent thing, right? Um, and the more you ask someone, like, tell me about your dieting history, right? Tell me about all the diets you've been, and they can name a laundry list for many people. And you'd hear this similar narrative. They lost weight quickly in the beginning. It was easy. And then they gain the weight back again in a perpetual cycle, right? So rejecting that idea that all you need is one more diet or all you need is to try harder. And that second point about trying harder is reinforced by a lot of the manufacturers of diets, right? So Weight Watchers or diet products aimed at losing weight. Um, it's the only industry, and Evelyn said this so well, it's the only industry where the manufacturer blames the consumer and the consumer doesn't blame the manufacturer when it doesn't work. When your product doesn't work, you get the blame for it, right? You failed the diet didn't fail you.
It's because you weren't strict enough within the rules that we gave you.
Right. So what would someone do if they didn't feel like they were strict enough and didn't work?
I mean, I think there might be two options. Either somebody tightens down because they're like, oh man, I really made this mistake, or they rebound, do the other option, and they feel bad about it, and they might end up rebounding back the other direction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And if those are your two options, neither of those are really good options, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people feel guilty. They feel almost hyper vigilant that next time I'm going to try even harder. I'm going to invest more money. I'm going to invest more time. I'm going to, have more discipline. So it becomes an ethical thing, right? It becomes a test of character rather than saying like, hey, this just doesn't work. So rejecting that for a lot of people is very difficult because of the environment we're in and how diets are praised.
Right. So with the idea of rejecting the diet mentality, let's maybe take this and draw some correlation between the diet mentality and maybe addiction. So if we talk about addiction and we look at when it comes to understanding addiction in your own mind, the very first step is always recognition of your addiction, right? And we can't change something unless we recognize that we have a problem. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to trying to reject the diet mentality, what are the things that we're really trying to recognize here? Like what are we looking to recognize in ourselves? So I mean, like we're looking at dieting, we're looking at all of these things, but there's so many factors that come to the diet mentality. Where does somebody start?
Yeah, it's just the biggest hurdle, and I think I think of terms that come to mind is self-acceptance, having grace for yourself and self-compassion, really underlying why do I want to diet? Why, what are the outcomes of dieting? Potentially being thinner, okay. Potentially being liked and more accepted by individuals. So I think really delving into those, and typically if I notice someone has very strong thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors ingrained into their thoughts around food, I like to work with a mental health professional because they can unravel and unpack a lot of these things that coincide with this this view that people have with food in a lifelong sense. You see people from a very young age being put on diets and told that their body's wrong and right. Dieting is going to fix it. And that's a narrative they hear throughout their life. So it's truly less about the food and more about that narrative of you're not enough or you don't look this way. So that's a really common underlying issue that we see.
For me, one of the things that resonated was my understanding, and this is something I slowly learned even before I heard about intuitive eating, was the way that my mother would talk to me in terms of just the way that certain things were framed in her mind. And she took care of me and she raised me and all of these things, and every parent does the best that they can. But in a lot of Asian cultures, there is a very strong diet mentality, and in my household it was always like, well, you're getting a little pudgy around the belly, okay, maybe go do some sit-ups and things like that. So it's like those things really spiraled in my head, and that I don't know necessarily created the diet mentality, but it certainly contributed to it. And then on top of it, social pressures. So for me, the recognition of the fact that I've been hearing these things since I was born, and we realize that we hear these things almost every single day. recognizing those things becomes easier and easier and easier the farther you go back and recognize that it did happen to us when we were born, you know? So we kind of covered a little bit about how someone might identify their own thoughts, behaviors, beliefs of the diet mentality. But can you maybe talk a little bit about some more of those points for kind of exploring our self in terms of
Yeah. So, individuals might think they've never been on a diet, but when you really unravel how you felt as you took care for yourself or didn't take care for yourself from a nutrition standpoint, you start to realize that that way of eating was actually depriving yourself from the nutrients and energy you needed. An example is, when people, I'm not on a diet, I'm eating healthy, right? You can turn any sort of food pattern into a diet if you're going to restrict for these following reasons: to lose weight, to be more socially accepted, things of that nature. So really unpacking, different fads that come and go within your eating. I think there are so many trends. At one point it was vegan, then it goes gluten-free, then it goes all these different things that our society centers around the idea of health, but in reality, it's reinforcing an ideal, it's reinforcing conformity in the sense of body size. So when you look at those things from that perspective, and start to think about how did that affect my relationships, right? Relationship with myself. Did I have more negative self-talk, or did I say positive things about myself and my body and the way I eat? How was my emotions and mood, right? Did I have lots of energy, or was I very upset and snappy when I didn't eat or get what I wanted to eat? How much time did I spend? Did I meal prep and miss out on things on the weekend because I had to stay home and be strict about the way I ate? How much money did I spend? Gosh, you can buy prepackaged meals and all these diet packages and spend tons of money. Even in an exercise sense, you can spend tons of money trying to lose weight. And think about, how much that actually costs you from a financial perspective. So all these little sacrifices could turn into, a big portion of our life, and try to reflect on those ideas. And they are very difficult. So I would recommend slowly unpacking those things, working with a health professional when doing so, because it is a very difficult thing.
Well, for rejecting diet mentality, one of the big things that comes with it is just learning to eat again, learning to eat the things that you really enjoy without any shame. When we eat those things and we feel that shame, how might we talk to ourselves and say that it's okay to ourselves, even if we really don't believe it just yet? How do we go about sort of ingraining that now that we're trying to reject the diet mentality? How do we continue with it? Because it's hard.
Absolutely. Part of it is internalization, right? So working on that internal diet mentality, that voice you just talked about, right? Being kind and compassionate to yourself, using language that's more caring. These are acts of self-care. I'm feeding myself, I'm nourishing myself, and it's okay. This food holds no moral grounds on who I am as a person. Just having those positive affirmations about food and your relationship, that's a great start. And it doesn't have to happen with every meal. Sometimes it's very difficult. There are meals that, at the end of the day that it's just hard to have that kind of mentality. So I like to try and, maybe start off with a snack. Start off, maybe on weekends or maybe on this day. Start off small and then try and build from there. The next step would be to try and look at the external influences you have that reinforce that mentality, right? What kind of ads am I seeing on Instagram? Who do I follow that reinforces this message that my body is the most important thing? What's the language like in my house or in my environment or with my family and friends? Is it positive about making foods neutral and positive body affirmations, or is it demeaning? Is it negative? Starting to look at those relationships and say, what are the best ways I can either neutralize these conversations or remove myself from them so I can protect myself when I'm trying to work on my relationship with food.
Okay. A lot of that comes with the idea of really backing off of the idea of weight loss, mostly as a way to using food as an idea for weight loss. But how do we maybe even address the opposite side of that issue for people who are trying to reject the diet mentality of trying to constantly gain weight, like in a way that might not necessarily be healthy from the other perspective. In a lot of weightlifting culture, just putting on mass period is huge. So people end up sort of developing binging issues. So for those people who have trouble gaining weight but want to really bad, how do they reject the diet mentality? Because usually the diet mentality is centered around dieting, losing weight, but we really don't think about binging as being a diet.
And you see this typically in younger adolescent males or even transgender individuals who are trying to conform to more predominant male features in gaining weight.
Right.
So it is the opposite end of the spectrum in a sense of the discussion around actually trying to gain weight. And that is also damaging to the relationship with food, right? We talked about from the very beginning, it's about interoceptive awareness internally. So when you start to disconnect from that, it becomes very difficult when you start to take external information. How much calories is in this? I just need to eat this quantity of food, right? All external information that we're using. So same concept, different situation. I will say there's a caveat within sports, and you mentioned it with weightlifting. And I've noticed this with impact or collision sports, where being larger, having more mass can be a safety measure. So, if there's a big discrepancy in weight and you both collide, you might be at a greater risk for injury than another individual. And that typically is at the highest levels, right? You don't really see this in like youth or high school sports, maybe in college or professional league. That's a particular case where in a short period of time, you might need to prioritize that individual safety from that standpoint over some principles intuitive eating. But once that period is over, you have to reconnect them with those internal cues. And that's where a health professional would be involved in that type of scenario. So I'm not saying that scenario should never happen, but the chances that it does is very small.
Yeah. So this principle, I mean, we could easily make an entire session out of just this principle alone and then some for sure. I mean, there's entire discussion centered around it for sure. One thing I might, before we move on to this next point, how does somebody, because this is a portion that requires a lot of interoceptive awareness that we might not have the tools to address. So how might somebody go about looking for a professional that is experienced in intuitive eating? I mean, like, is that stuff available? I mean, as a new framework or newish framework, how do we go about finding somebody who's an expert?
Yeah, so on Intuitive Eating's website, I think it's intuitiveeating.com, they have a search bar with a map, and you can search for your region for dietitians or other professionals who are trained intuitive eating counselors. So they are formally trained in intuitive eating, and a lot of them, due to COVID, work virtually. So that's an option for a lot of people. I think a great start is to get the intuitive eating book and just maybe work through that. That's always a great start. There's free YouTube videos on those types of things, and it's a process. Some people take longer, some people take shorter. And unpacking a lot of these things takes lots of time. So I would say, in today's climate, societal climate too, take your time, have a lot of self-compassion. You don't need to figure it out, in a week or 2 weeks. It's at your own pace.
Yeah. I'm the type of person that likes to rush to my end goal knowing. So it's good to know that these are the types of things that are going to take time, and that progress is really the key. It's not necessarily, we're not really trying to get all 10 of these goals to happen in the next 2 weeks. So, so with that, let's jump into that second principle. What is the second principle?
The second principle is honoring your hunger. So going back to that interoceptive awareness, it's just tuning in, being able to say, what is my level of hunger they developed a hunger scale, 1 through 10, 1 being ravaging hungry, 10 being Thanksgiving stuffed, right? And kind of using that as a proxy to how much you'd like to eat, if you need to eat it all, those types of things.
Okay.
Just tuning into that to help keep our body biologically fed.
So when you say now we're tuning in and we're trying to keep it biologically fed, so we're really looking at trying to fuel our activity level and our daily energy expenditure. So that and last week we talked about it, but we didn't really get to or no, yeah, it was 2 weeks ago to talk about the 4 forms of hunger. So let's resum those up. And then I'll post a link in so that you guys can go check out the 4 forms of hunger in a little bit more detail, because we really, Davin really outlined those pretty well. So Davin, can you go into those?
Yeah, so there are 4 forms of hunger. The first one is the most commonly known is physical. The second one is emotional. The third one is practical. And the fourth one is taste. Physical, briefly, is just, those sensations we get when we're hungry. Headaches, lethargic, stomach growling. Many people are very aware of these types of things. The second one is emotional, right? So we eat for various different reasons, whether we're sad or happy. So we have hunger in that sense, and we might want to eat, just an emotional state. The third one is practical. Athletes use this one a lot. People who work jobs that are on their feet all day use practical hunger, so they might eat because they know they're not going to eat again, so they might eat a little bit more, just like putting more fuel in the tank, per se. And the last one is taste. Satisfying that taste hunger that we have for, novel foods. If grandma makes her certain pie, or like we go to another country and they have a food that sounds awesome. Satisfying that need for taste is very big as well.
So all of these you would consider to be feeding and honoring each of these types of hungers would keep us biologically fed.
Yeah. So in a biological, like just energy, pure energy standpoint, that's kind of the one we'll focus on first. The other 3, a little more nuanced, but it's very appropriate to kind of delve into those 2 because they do exist. And we do eat for lots of reasons, especially right now when, maybe physically we're not doing a whole lot, right? We're at home, for the safety of ourselves and others, and we have different needs to be met, and food is one way we can meet those needs.
Yeah, so that's one thing I definitely would like to talk on. So keeping us biologically fed, fueling our activity level, that's kind of the physical hunger piece, but we don't realize that our hunger really affects our emotional state. I mean, we do realize it, I think, but satisfying our emotional state through food, using food as a tool to satisfy our emotional state, is something that people, or I think society, really has a negative connotation around. Oh, you're drowning your sadness in ice cream or something, those types of things. And so in that other video, we talk a little bit more about that, but I'd like to maybe talk about why fueling our emotional hunger also is keeping us biologically fed, maybe from like a science perspective, or from a strict nutritional perspective. Like when we're feeding those emotional pieces, what is that doing in our brain? Like the different chemicals, the serotonin, and all of that, dopamine. When we get those, why are those so important?
Mm-hmm. We will talk about that in real detail, in real good detail, because it's a principle down the road, actually.
Great.
Taking care of your emotions without using food, or in some cases with using food. But to comment on that, sometimes we mistake our physical hunger, or lack thereof, actually, lack of energy, for emotional hunger, right? Like, I need to eat because I'm so stressed. But in reality, maybe you didn't eat for 5-6 hours, and that's why you're stressed. That emotion is a direct response that's mimicking physical hunger, right? So being able to dissociate, okay, am I actually physically hungry and it's coming off as stress, anxious, because they can mimic one another, or am I just stressed and anxious, and how can I cope with those things? And something we'll talk about in the future. But definitely with honoring hunger, it's being able to dissociate physical hunger, emotional hunger, and then one when they start to look like one another because they can. And just don't eat for 5 hours, and you'll start to have those emotions arise. But
Right.
that's really due to hunger.
Okay. So how might we go about practicing this in terms of being able to satisfy those different pieces and honoring them appropriately?
Yeah, a great way I like to have people start is just to write down what their hunger level is before they eat. For maybe a couple days is like, am I a 5? Am I adequate, or am I a 7? And I'll send you the link for the hunger scale. Am I 7? Could I use another bite, or am I okay just stopping here? Checking in before and after you eat. The odds that someone goes from a 1, so ravaging hungry, to a 10 is very likely, right? You jump the scale very high.
Yeah.
But going from maybe a 4, you're not going to overeat. You're not going to miss all these check-ins down the road. So checking in before and after. Another thing is checking with your emotions. How do I feel? Am I stressed? Was today a hard day? Am I feeling really happy? And how is that affecting the foods I want to eat? That's a really a big thing. Or did I just come back from the gym? Am I exhausted and like, I did a really hard glycogen depleting workout, and that's why I just really want carbohydrates right now, and that's a perfectly logical explanation for those things.
All right. So with honoring your hunger, I mean, what sort of events are we really looking for, and those types of variations? So you talked about checking in before and after. Like what are the types of events, maybe the major ones that that might happen in our daily life that somebody might be able to say, like, okay, that there's something that happens to me every day, or like maybe centered around breakfast or something. Do you have some maybe more specific events that we might be able to keep track of that might be common?
I think to start off, it should be with maybe the most easiest meal, where you have that mindfulness piece, where you're sitting and you're present. Maybe it's a quiet house and you're going to have us sit down for breakfast for the first meal, and you can check in. Slowly that will start to evolve into, okay, it's a very chaotic day. I'm very, very busy, and or maybe at the tail end of a busy day, where we start to lose that interoceptive awareness. We can't perceive what's going on anymore. Mm-hmm. So we really have to tune in and say, am I hungry, and what do I want, and how much do I need? Because when that signal gets really weak is when we want to fall on this tool the most. But it takes time to develop. So we really want to start with maybe the lowest hanging fruit and saying, like, clear mind, I have the ability to think about these things, let's go for it.
So like practicing when it's easy, so that when it starts to get hard, you kind of have this underlying basis of understanding.
Right. Like I wouldn't go straight for July 4th and say, that's the first day I'm going to start intuitive eating. And that might not be the best idea. Or like wait till November and say, Thanksgiving's a great day to start. Like those larger events make it hard for us to connect with our body. And that's the ones we might need it most. But at the same time, it's kind of like a paradox, and this is where we start to get to the differences of rule versus guideline. I can be full, right? I can be 9 out of 10, but it's July 4th, it's Thanksgiving, and it's going against my hunger to eat more, but I'm giving myself permission to eat more to satisfy maybe taste and things like that. So it is a paradox. It is a guideline in a sense, but we can still honor our hunger by choosing to eat even past our fullness.
Okay. So really trying to achieve that balance between those different 4 types of hunger. So part of honoring that means achieving balance between those when it's appropriate. And balance could mean you are not satisfying your physical hunger in such a way, like the example, you're the overeating, you're not satisfying your physical hunger. You've now sort of stressed that physical hunger, but you satisfied that taste. So you kind of get that balance out. So
right.
It's like, oh man, I'm so full, but like that cake was delicious. Like you're still happy that you ate cake. Like who's not? So it's, so yeah, that's a really interesting way to look at it. And that kind of ties back into some of that mindfulness, and that mindfulness even um, the mindfulness of understanding that it's okay to let yourself do something.
Absolutely. And some people who mindfully eat using the hunger scale would say, okay, you're at a 7, you should stop eating, because if you eat more, this, and this will happen. And that's a rule, right? That sounds very much like a rule and not like a guideline. So that's a huge difference between intuitive eating and mindfulness through this principle.
Gotcha. Okay, awesome. Again, all of these principles, there's so much that we can dive into, but I think that this kind of that the balance kind of brings us into this third principle of making peace. Can you talk about what making peace with your food really means?
Yeah, this is the principle. When I bring it up, people look at me funny. They think it's too good to be true, or they almost scoff at me like, you're a health professional, how can you advocate for this type of thing? And it's quite the opposite. And it's one of those things that um, I like this principle so much, because people really start to figure things out using this one, and it's making peace with food. The term I like to use is unconditional permission to eat. So it doesn't matter what, it doesn't matter when, it doesn't matter how much. You give yourself permission to eat those foods regardless. So this breaks down a lot of rules people have, right? It breaks down the good and bad food rule. It breaks down the I should only eat 3 meals. I shouldn't eat this extra thing, or I shouldn't eat. I just ate. Don't eat past 6 p.m. I've heard that one way too much.
Yeah.
But it's breaking down all these food rules people have and saying you can eat whenever you want. It's helping you tune into your interoceptive awareness and using that as a proxy for what you want to eat and when you want to eat it.
So this is something, and I've seen a lot of different arguments for why making peace with your food is so important, but also why it's so difficult. And you mentioned it because it breaks down some of these good and bad food rules. What do you mean by good and bad food rules?
Yeah. I mean it not in the sense that are good rules and bad rules, but just these things are good and these things are bad as a rule.
Right.
So essentially, when we start to categorize it that way, we create foods that are forbidden, right? And these foods automatically have this allure about them, right? There's this sensational thing about the food that other foods don't have. And what happens when we give ourselves permission to eat those foods in a dieting mindset, we never really actually taste those foods. We don't eat mindfully when we eat them. We just eat them in what we call our Last Supper context. So if I were to go on a diet tomorrow, typically what would happen with most dieters is I would eat tonight all the foods I know I couldn't eat because it's the last time I'll ever eat these, the last time I'd ever eat these foods. And that type of behavior is very disordered. But it's putting that food on the pedestal and saying, I don't have permission to eat this food anymore, that drives the deprivation. And biologically, I will be more predisposed to binging on that food, to having cravings or addictions, as people would call them, to like foods like sugar particularly. And then feeling guilty about eating those foods, or even other people who eat those foods, and kind of maybe almost saying like, oh, you're eating that, or shaming them for eating those foods. So it's a very dark hole that people will draw themselves into once you start to restrict or forbid foods for people.
Right. And there's actually one example that Evelyn Tribole gave when she was being interviewed in Dan, what's his last name?
Harris.
Dan Harris, yeah. So that very first podcast that you had sent me, and she discusses one thing about how she was working with a client, and they were she asked, okay, well, what's one of your favorite foods? He says, oh, I really love Hershey's Kisses. And he's like, whenever I get the chance, I just binge on some Hershey's Kisses. I really just love them so much. And she's like, okay, I mean, that's cool, but like, you know, Hershey's Kisses are great, but why not try Godiva chocolate? Why not try Dove chocolate? And then immediately he was like, I guess I never really thought of it that way. I just wanted Hershey's Kisses so bad because I love them and I taste them so often that's what I think about. But I never really thought about getting something that actually really is truly delicious. And then she talked about kind of working through these things, and he went back and he tried tasting these Hershey's Kisses after really getting to enjoy that good chocolate. And he's like, I don't even like them anymore. They just taste like chalk. And I thought that was so wild to me. Hi, Lance. My wife just got home. And that was so wild to me, and it makes so much sense when you're talking about, like, you assign these, like, these Hershey's, these Kisses are forbidden and I can't eat them, but then when you really sit down and you taste them, it's like, okay, well, I could, if I'm going to eat them, I might as well eat something better, if I'm so. Yeah, it's really interesting. The idea of good foods, I think, is just as important of a point. So we assign a lot of these bad foods. So what's kind of the disadvantage of assigning too many foods as being a good label?
Yeah, it's you can't have good without bad,
right?
As I would kind of surmise. I think good foods too, it puts that moral context into things where I eat good foods, therefore I'm good, and you don't eat those good foods, so therefore you're not good. This kind of narrative gets really ingrained since we're kids, right? What are good foods when you're kids? Fruits and vegetables. And from a scientific nutrition standpoint, you're not wrong, but that would also devise a line where these are all bad foods as a child, right? Candy and other things that we're told. So I think to reframe the language we use around foods that are highly nutritious, I think that's a strategy that I'd rather use rather than saying these are good foods. Then people ask, what are bad foods? So there's really no good or bad. There's foods that are foods, and trying to balance those out. There's studies that show that Evelyn has used that show that intuitive eaters have a more balanced diet and less restriction, and they actually meet more requirements from the nutritional guidelines than dieters or even other regular eaters. So it's actually a better way to eat to be more nutritionally well-rounded.
That's you brought up a point I want to talk about there with the what about when you're a kid? What are the foods that you hear about? Like, okay, well, vegetables are the healthy foods. But what do you want when you're a kid? You want the thing you can't have. I mean, this is what everybody wants, so that kind of comes back to that bad forbidden food. We assign that. So I'd like to maybe take a second for any parents who might be watching, somebody who has kids, think about the impact of really labeling a food as being particularly forbidden, but you kind of indicate that it's delicious and it's forbidden at the same time. So that makes somebody want it. Like, think about that impact. So what kind of impact does that lead to when we grow up?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to further comment on that, to the parents, when we start to say foods are good and bad, children think in very black and white sense, right? So if uncle or auntie eats this bad food, does that mean uncle and auntie are bad? It doesn't make sense in our heads, right? We're like, no, that doesn't make any sense. But to a child, that's what they might perceive it to be. Mm-hmm. So really trying to change and diversify our language to be more inclusive. And all foods are good foods. If someone ever asked me as a dietitian, oh, this is good for you, right? I'd say, yeah, it's all good for you, right? All the foods are good.
Mm-hmm. It's keeping you alive. It's good for you, I think.
Unless you stole it or unless you didn't wash it and it's got dirt all over it, it's probably bad or it's rotten. Then I wouldn't eat it. Then you should not eat those things. But other than that, it's all good food.
Yeah. So there's a lot, you've discussed this a little bit about the paradoxical aspect of some of these things and kind of being comfortable with the paradox. What is the paradox principle as it's outlined in Making Peace?
Yeah. So just to kind of stick on this example of using children as an example, when we give children permission to do things, we typically think that they're going to just do them all the time in all the ways, right? There's this urgency, this excitement that you have permission now, like I'm just going to do it all the time. So like children have permission, an example. You have permission as a child to all the candy and cookies you want in the cupboard. It's always going to be there. You never have to worry about not having. I'm going to have it for you. To which most parents would say, that's not going to be good. They're just going to get sugar rushes and they're going to get cavities and going to gain weight, and they're always going to eat it. They're never going to eat dinner. And what we actually see out of these kinds of studies, looking at this particular permission to do things, is this thing called habituation. It's a phenomenon where kids get so used to the food, it's not novel anymore.
Right.
We did a study with college students, and they gave them free pizza every time they showed up to the study. On day 23, no one wanted pizza anymore, right?
Like, I'm sick of pizza. Yeah.
Exactly. So giving yourself permission helps you get over that idea that this food has control or you're addicted to it, and it becomes no longer novel. You might still like the food. That's perfectly fine. But you might find out, like, I don't really like this food too much, or like, I only like it when it's this way. Like, I love pizza, right? But I'm not just going to settle for any pizza. I want like very like high, hot pizza, crispy, this topping, or I'm not going to eat it, right? So you start to be more selective because you know what you like.
That's that really resonates, because there's when I was kind of / still am going through this. I mean, we've talked about this in one of our previous meetings, like what is one of those things that you really love is Oreos. And so when I started getting into intuitive eating, I literally bought 3 boxes of Oreos, and I ended up going through that first box, and then that second box was slower, and that third box just kind of sat there and on my shelf for like 2 weeks. And that would never have happened if I didn't really give myself permission to say, like, you know, it's okay to eat these Oreos. You know, they're not forbidden. They're not gone. There's 400 boxes at the store that you can go grab at any time. And when I started to give myself permission, it felt better. And now I can eat Oreos and not feel ashamed about it, and know that I can eat a couple, and I have more to go up to later if I happen to want some. But I'm not gonna shove 11 of them into my face right now. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. When people start to work on this rule and giving themselves permission, it's super difficult, right? Maybe you might see your clothes getting tighter. You know, weight gain, weight stability, weight loss, it might happen in intuitive eating. And I can't guarantee one way or the other. Your body's going to do what it wants to do, and then what's making it feel good. And that's the bottom line. But you might notice your clothes starting to get tighter, or you don't fit certain things anymore. And what people's logics might be is like, oh, it's the food and I should cut back on it. But in reality, that's the point in time where you should give yourself more permission to have the food, then start restricting or restraining it. It's a very difficult thing to do. But I would find that that's the tipping point where once you can get over that, it's liberating, it's freedom. These foods have no control over you anymore, and things like that.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's great. So summarizing real quick, I think we're kind of coming towards the end here. Summarizing really these first 3 principles we have, the first one is rejecting the diet mentality. And again, I mean, that can be a separate conversation in and of itself. The next is going to be honoring your hunger. And then the third is making peace with your food. And but one last note I would like to ask you is that the order of them? Like, is that like, do we stick to a particular order? Do we start by rejecting the diet mentality and then learn how to honor our hunger? Is there an order to it?
According to Evelyn and Elise, they don't really go in a particular order. They sometimes forget the order and they just know all the principles and list them in whatever the way they remember them.
Right.
I don't think there's a particular order. I would say what sounds most attractive to you is maybe the first thing to work on. And
catch that one first.
Yeah, I mean, the first one, reject the diet mentality. I think that one arguably could take the most work for most individuals, but you might find individuals who find other principles to be harder than others. So maybe just go through them all. That's what I did, is I went through the book and then I said, this is the one I want to work on first. So.
Yeah, great. So if anybody's interested in the rest of the principles, we'll be slowly getting to those in the coming weeks. So the next 3 principles, principle number 4, challenging the food police. Number 5 is discover the satisfaction factor. And number 6 is feel your fullness. So Davin is going to give us the rundown on those next few principles after this. So before we hop off though, do you have any final comments?
Just super hyped up to talk about this. I think if this stuff excites you, that's awesome. And I think it's a first step, and I'm really excited to see if I can help out any way. Me or Cole, feel free to shoot us messages, and we'd love to chat with you on a one-on-one basis about this type of stuff. And just super pumped for this.
Yeah, same here. So, all right. Well, Davin, thank you again for chatting as usual, and we'll be talking soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Cole.
All right. See you later, Davin.